for everybody. Thank you to everybody for taking the time on a Friday morning to join our webinar on position limits today. We have a pretty multidisciplinary audience from a variety of functions within trading organizations here, compliance, project focus people, operations, and IT people as well. And so what we plan on talking about is position limits from a legal perspective. We have an expert, Dina Reitman, here from Figure Drinker. Welcome, Dina, to talk in detail from a compliance perspective, from a legal perspective, give her expertise in interpreting the rules that we have to be compliant with. And then we're also going to talk from a project perspective. I'm going to play the role of a person trying to interpret those rules and be Dina's, peer at work to say, okay, Dina, how do we go and implement these things? And so at the end of the hour, we hope that you walk away with a good understanding of what position limits are, what the rules say that we must be compliant with. And then how do we actionize some of those ideas and stay compliant and establish a robust program of compliance? And also some of the traps you might want to avoid. So hopefully there's some good practical takeaways as well as some high-level legal expertise here. We want to make it a pretty free-flowing discussion. There is a chat facility and a Q&A facility, particularly in Zoom. Ask questions. I've got it up here on my little monitor. We'll pull them into the chats live. So if there's something that we say that strikes a chord, chat away. We want to make it a useful discussion for everybody. Chances are 5 or 6 other people probably have the same question you do. There are CLE credits available for this webinar, and so we'll go through those as we go through the slides where you can scan the QR codes and look for your code words throughout the presentation. With that, actually, let me hand it to Dina for a second to give herself an introduction, and I'll introduce myself and we'll kick off.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Dina Reitman. I'm a partner with the law firm Figure Drinker. No one ever knows how to say it, and that's okay. This is how you remember. We are your favorite lawyers, Figure Drinker. But either way, you just have to remember my name if you have any questions after this. And my name is Dina Reitman again. Spelled really weird. I'm not making this easy for you. It's spelled like Deanna, but it's Dina. I have been in commodities since I've been 18 years old, and even being in commodities and energy trading and all these things since 18. Even when I read the rules, I think I know what they mean and how they can be implemented. But when you go and you implement systems, you then have questions about the practicalities of it. So what we'll do is we'll go through the legal, we'll go through the regulatory, and then we'll talk about the practical implications or the practical application of the law, the rules, the regs to what you're doing every day. And you can have a question and you should use the Q&A, and we may or may not have the answer, because I will tell you, since 18 years old, and I will not tell you how old I am now, I still come up with questions. And I've been at startups, and I've been at banks, and I've been at very large oil companies before I was at a law firm. And still, when you want to implement the practices, you can have questions, and that's okay. It's all okay. I know you call me an expert, but really, I don't know if anybody can be an expert. It's a matter of taking the time, asking the questions, and not being afraid to just say, hey, I don't know what that could mean in this situation. So use the Q&A, and we'll give you the materials after, and hopefully you find it helpful.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dina. As an introduction, myself, I'm Vivek Pathak. I'm one of the founders and the COO here daily at BroadPeak. We're a software vendor in this space, doing things like trade connectivity to markets, real-time P&L, compliance around things like position limits and trade surveillance. So a good amount of expertise in the space. Same as Dina. I've been in the energy markets since I was 18 as well. I'm a chemical engineer by training. I've built gas plants and refineries and power plants. Moved into the trading and technology side of things the last few years. I am not an attorney, but I actually have read all the rules line by line because I'm a nerd. And so I hopefully can give you a point of engagement on how to practically apply some of these rules. All right, let's get started. First slide, for all the attorneys out there looking for credits, you'll want to scan this QR code and take notes. The secret code words will come throughout the slides. I'll leave this up here for a minute just to let people take a snapshot.
So I'm not seeing the presentation on the screen. Is it there?
Should be.
Yeah, I can't see it either. Thank you, Sharon. I was just telling Vivek.
Yeah, you don't see it?
Mm-mm.
Let me try again. Apologize.
There's a share screen button at the bottom screen.
I think I know what happened.
There you go. Now go to the QR code because the attorneys will have to scan that QR code. So
How's
just
that?
to reiterate, you scan this QR code to get your CLE. There will be code words throughout the presentation. When you hear the code words, write them down, and then you can submit for your certificate of attendance. With that being said, I think we should get into it because we're kind of 10 minutes in. So let's just talk about position limits and what they are, just to level set. Okay, so position limits, what are they? I know you're all on here, so you know what they are, but I like to start from the beginning. They are limits on the number of speculative positions that can be held by a person when they're established by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and also the exchanges or the designated contract markets. Now, the word person, for those that are not lawyers, may seem confusing, but by definition, a person in the regs and the law is an individual, an association, a partnership, a corporation, or a trust. So it literally applies to any entity that you can think of. And the federal position limits are in two categories. There are spot month speculative position limits, and then there are single month and all month combined speculative position limits. So the spot month speculative position limits are for physically delivered referenced contracts and for separately cash settled referenced contracts. And that means that no person, remember the word person means companies, and that's an important thing to remember when we talk about aggregation later, can hold or control positions in the spot month, either net long or net short, beyond the position limit. So what is a reference contract? A reference contract is the core reference contract, which is listed in the regulation, which I'll show you on the next slide. And it is the particular core reference contract or futures contract or an option on that futures contract, including the spread that is linked directly or indirectly to those core reference futures contracts. So I'm going to go to the next slide, if you don't mind going to the next slide, slide 6. Slide 6 shows you a listing of the core referenced futures contracts. It's to the right there. So they're agricultural contracts, metals, and energy contracts. So remember, the position limits apply to the reference futures contracts. But in addition to the core reference futures contract, a future contract or an option on a future contract is a reference contract, which also means the position limits apply to them if they are directly or indirectly linked, either partially or completely, on a price that is fixed or differential or a price that is particular to that core reference futures contract. Now, there's another definition in the law as to how you can be a reference contract to a core reference futures contract, and that is the second bullet point there, which is that you are directly or indirectly linked, whether partially or fully, or price at a fixed differential to the price of the same commodity that underlies a particular reference core future contracts. You can see what they're trying to do here. The federal government here is trying to limit the amount of exposure or risk exposure to these core commodities, essentially. And by setting position limits, they're saying we are making it so that we are limiting the amount of speculation on things that are really important to our economy, such as agricultural products, our food supply, metal, and energy. So if you go to slide 7, with the introduction of Dodd-Frank in 2008, we also had to deal with swaps, or what the regulations now call economically equivalent swaps, because you could have a swap that has nothing to do with the future, but to be tied to one of these core commodities. And so after Dodd-Frank, they created this concept of economically equivalent swap. And an economically equivalent swap means, with respect to a particular reference contract, any swap that has an identical material contractual specification, term, or condition that sort of looks like that reference contract, right? And they define what a material specification is, and it essentially is limited to provisions of that swap that drive its economic value. So again, the underlying commodity, its maturity or termination dates, and the settlement type, right? Cash settled or physically settled. And if you have one of these economically equivalent swaps, they need to also be rolled up into your position in order for you to determine whether you meet or have met or have exceeded the position limit. Now, the material contract specifications don't include things like lot size, because you can know lot size is very different in all swaps, delivery date, and things like that, right? But I have to tell you, even though it's a very narrow definition of what is an economically equivalent swap, it does trip some people up sometimes when they're trying to figure out how to implement rules and controls for systems to make sure that they're even, A, capturing the right data, right? You have to make sure you have the right contracts, and then B, making sure you're within the position limits. So to help us sort of understand how that's dealt with in a practical fashion, if you go to slide 8, Vivek's going to tell you like what he sees when he's implementing his software, or even he's seen in other just throughout his career in commodities, how you implement these types of position limits. So Vivek, would you mind going to slide 8 and letting people know?
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Dina. So when I hear all that Dina described as a practitioner on the data side, as a technologist, I say, geez, I've got to get all my futures together. And some of them are in this system, some of them over there. Different legal entities across the globe may have different systems, different places, but I got to get all my futures together. And I got to be able to normalize them into a single place, because the Brent futures traded by London and Geneva and New York and Houston actually are in one place, even though there might be 4 different systems. So I need to gather the data. That's the biggest green thing in my head. It's like, okay, the first thing is get all the data together. Futures to start with, but then as Dina said, there are swaps that look like the futures that have the same exposure. And then as the nerd in me starts going, wait, how do I know which swaps go to which futures? Because the swaps are on something else, the futures are on something else. Here's a key. People ask me this a lot. The index that those swaps are settling on are the same index that the future is settling on. So from an economic perspective, when you think about mapping your data, your swaps into futures, you want to use something like an index or economic settlement index against which they settle to do that mapping. So, people conceptually understand that. What are the challenges towards getting that done? I sort of articulated a hypothetical example with 4 different centers of trading with 4 different systems. That's probably maybe too far-fetched, but it's not that far-fetched. Most of the customers we deal with, even small ones, have multiple systems, multiple geographies, multiple data attributes that they have to aggregate together to be able to compute their position. And so one thing I'd say is, like, even if you do it once and you say, great, we did it once, the minute you start trading new futures or new swaps, there's maintenance required. So one thing is, it's not a one-time forget it. Your business moves. You're going to start trading new things, and you have an ongoing capability requirement to funnel all that data into a single view so you can do the position limits management. The other thing that was talked about is like the exposures, right? What Dina rightly described what the government's trying to do. There is necessarily some cross-exchange aggregation required to see if TC limits. So like there's multiple views I need to be able to maintain. And as long as I have my data organized, I can slice and dice it and pivot it a couple of different ways, but it's a data exercise. And the things that people get trapped in that we see is not taking a longer term view to maintaining this stuff. You lose compliance sort of connection to the issues like position limits as your business evolves. So a program will be put in place and it works for a few months. As the business evolves, things start going awry, and then your compass is off. It's not quite pointing north. And so it's whatever you're producing as an output from that system is no longer reliable. And you get to the point where you need some hero efforts to do one-time checks where a compliance person will come and say, hey, we've got some new swaps that we just bought a book. Can you just kind of aggregate those in to see what our limits would look like roughly? And that one-time check is useful for a one-time point of compliance, but it's not as useful a week out, or 2 weeks out. And so what we try to advocate is use machines to do these things, make it an ongoing capability, and you don't have to struggle. I'll hand it back to Dina to talk on further topics. And I'll...
And so you're probably thinking, well, it doesn't apply to me. It can't be that big of a deal. Like, what are these limits? But actually, the limits are kind of low. So the spot month position limits, if you go to slide 9, there are spot month limits for all 25 core reference futures contracts and their related referenced contracts. So I gave you a little bit of an example of how low they could possibly be, right, in that box on slide 9. So there are spot limits for physically delivered reference contracts that apply on an aggregated basis. And we're going to talk about what aggregated means. Another one that trips folks up sometimes. And then there's one exception to that, and that is there are spot month limits on cash settled reference contracts for natural gas on an aggregate basis. And if you go to slide 10, we'll provide you, or I've provided you with the table of the non-spot position limits, right? So what I talked to you about earlier, the categories, this is the single month and the all month category. And this is the table of what they are. There are single month and all month combined limits on 9 agricultural contracts. But making sure that you have the right data and the right controls to pick up, the physically settled, right? The spot month, when does the position limit kick in, is something that also requires systems and data. And so for that, I'll turn it back to Vivek,
Yeah.
to slide 11, to talk about, how do you actually get the data together, aggregated, which we'll talk about later, to see if you even hit these limits.
So got the data part of my head. I figured that out. And now Dina's laying out the idea that there's some numbers we got to make sure that we're under. And some of those numbers are actually remarkably low. So I kind of like conceptually walk away with this distilled view for what position limits is. And it's in my colloquial nerd terms, it's the max number of future contracts you could be long or short in particular months. Now, that particular months is important to pick up on because it's not just like the spot month. There were other periods that Dina was talking about. So now I know, okay, I have to be like within the limits in a certain period of time. As I look at those limits and I look at how they're declared, they're typically on spreadsheets on the exchange websites or prudential regulators websites like the ASMA or FCA or CFTC. And they change regularly and they changed unbeknownst to me because I'm not looking at them every day. And so what we see a lot of times is like there's some manual efforts required to be aware of where the limits are on a given day. Now, the exchanges do a really good job of telling you here's some upcoming stuff. But if you want to have a view for all sorts of products and potentially something you weren't trading today, and a trader says, hey, what would be the impact of us doing some new activity in XYZ products? You'd want to know what the limits are on those products. And that's hard to actually look up. And so one of the things we see when there's manual efforts used to say what the limit is internally, you can often be looking at a speed limit per se that's old, right? And you wouldn't do that today. You'd look at the speed limit based on today's driving standards. So oftentimes we see folks exceeding a limit without knowing, but we'll get customers coming to us saying, hey, we think we were told we tripped a limit. We thought the limit was X. It's actually, 80% of X because it got reduced without their awareness. And so sometimes sometimes the limits go up. And so you may actually constrain the desk from a market opportunity if you're looking at dated information. So the takeaway here is the limits change pretty regularly. And so solution-wise internally as a software company, we actually digest all the limits every day and put them like in a single database with a little web UI in front of it. So our compliance customers can kind of just type in Henry and see Henry Hub's limits in various markets easily. So as much as there are manual efforts, we're trying to, as an industry, make it more electronic, more programmatic. Another attribute of that is the various periods. So spot start date I start thinking about. So we have a position limit, but when do I have to be compliant with that limit? It's when the product goes into spot. Typically, when I hear people talk about spot, they think that's the front month position. So at the start of the contract, the limits are in effect. Every product type is a little different. For power and gas, it's one. For oil, it's another. The one thing that's interesting here is like the nerd in me says, give me a calendar. Hey, exchanges. Hey, CFTC, give me a calendar. I'll just listen to that calendar. There is no such calendar. So when I first dug into this, started reading the rules, I was like, oh, there's all these reference to dates. Where's the dates? There's no dates. So the legal language you see here in the middle of this slide talks about how to describe that date. The spot month position limits for Henry Hub, LD1, yada, yada, yada. We actually we wrote a domain-specific language to turn all that legal language into an actionable set of calendar dates. We thought that was useful for the industry, and we published that out. Why did we do that? Is because we saw the traps in a lot of folks that we talked to is that they have compliance insights at the front month because the exchange publishes a PDF that says, here's the upcoming dates you must be in compliant with, and here's the limits. But further out the curve, they have no insights. And so the traders 2-3 months down the curve have positions that are quite higher than limits. And as they become proximate, there's this intense debate of who's going to reduce their position because we didn't give them any forewarning to say, hey, there's a ceiling coming, it's 10 feet high, your 20-foot balloon's going to have to shrink down. We've never given that warning. And so there's a lot of intensity. And it's not a great place to be as a compliance person to be like, hey, last minute, by the way, change your position. That's not a good position to be in for any business. So the spot dart dates putting as a calendar, we did partly because we're nerds, partly because I think it really helps people manage their business further out the curve. And with that, we have our first CLE word, compliance.
You see, record that code. Okay. So that being our first code, let's go to some more law and reg. So the position limits are net. They're net position limits. So they apply to the physical deliver reference contract on a net basis. Of course, like I told you already, with the exception of natural gas, which also applies to cash settled. So it's not, again, it's not like you can just be like, oh, well, I have X position, over here that I'm long, X position over here that I'm short, and none of those meet the limits or whatever. You have to actually net them out and then see if you meet the spot month limit. Actually, in my opinion, when we practically apply that, that seems to work better. You do get a little bit more of the ability to manage your positions better using the net calculation. But it is another calculation so that you know your position before, like Vivek said, you get too close to the end of that spot month position limit, and you're telling your front office business folks you have to unwind positions. All of it's on net. If you go to slide 15, I'm on slide 15 here. Let me turn it. Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Go back.
Looking at a different screen. Nope, go ahead. This is good. So I was talking earlier about the CFTC sets limits. So the CFTC sets limits, and it's almost like you would think of it as like the ceiling, because each separate exchange can also set limits, right? Oh, he can't hear me. They can also set limits. So each exchange also can set limits, but they can't set the limits above the CFTC limits. And that makes sense. That should make sense to y'all, because the CFTC rules are the final rules, right? And so market participants should continue to monitor the CFTC limits, but they also have to make sure that for the market that they're on, the exchanges that they're on, that they are aware of also the exchange limits, and that they are also monitoring the exchange limits. Now, the CFTC goes beyond regulating the market participant. They also regulate the exchanges, and they need to make sure that these exchanges have the ability to set, monitor, and enforce these limits. And one of the things that they're focusing on lately is if they're able to set, monitor, and be able to effectively pull in and control the economically equivalent swaps. Because again, after Dodd-Frank, it was all about what sort of risk are we putting on our economy overall in our food supply, for example, which was very, very important to them. So you will see that DCMs can set spot limits and not spot limits, which they often call accountability levels, so long as they're within the CFTC framework. So your data has to be even more granular, not just the position, what exchange. So next slide. This leads us back to Vivek, because there is a concept of product aggregation here that also needs to be taken into account when we're building out our compliance controls.
So I purposely use the word aggregation here because it gets used in two different contexts, and it's important to call out. Dina's going to talk later on from a legal context where aggregation is really important from a CCO perspective. From a nerd data perspective, we use aggregation. It means we just add stuff together. And so there is a product aggregation concept that is described in the spreadsheets from the exchanges as to how one contract aggregates into another contract, sometimes at a 1-to-1 ratio. As Dina was talking about, it's a net position, sometimes at a ratio of a mini to a regular contract. Sometimes there are spreads, there are options, BALMOs. There's a whole bunch of logic by which your positions get aggregated and netted, the logic is distributed across all these websites. And again, we programmatically bring that in and put it in an API in the cloud because I don't want anybody typing by hand to find this stuff. Again, we don't want manual intervention to try to do this in Excel, because what happens is what we see in Excel is folks will generally aggregate positions the way the risk desk would aggregate positions. And it's close. It's close. We're talking about exposures. I think Dean described it well. We're talking about exposure to food supply, things that have settle on the same index should be aggregated in. That was an important concept as a part of this limits regime. However, the aggregation rules there from a perspective of economic risk to this food supply is not the way products would roll up from a risk exposure perspective in your trading systems. They are materially different. I cannot stress that enough. You walk away from one thing, and it's a question actually that someone has asked here on the chat, and I'll bring it in here, is like, given that the spot positions are sort of up front and there isn't really a look downstream, how do you automate alerts or adapt compliance insights for further along the curve? It's a fantastic question. I sort of talked to it a little bit. I'll address it here, is that you probably don't do it typically from your risk systems because the positions that they're generally computing are not adhering to this logic and rules. It's adhering to how you see the world from an economic risk perspective. So there is a fundamental difference there. And so typically to answer the question that was asked, we generally see this done outside of the trading system in purpose-built systems meant to manage position limits because of the difference. And the traps of sort of just falling into that typical way of the way you see the world to aggregate positions instead of the prescriptions from the exchanges and the regulators is that you're just going to default to risk positions and your numbers will actually be wrong. They'll be right-ish. So if you only trade heating oil futures and you're like, hey, we only have heating futures. We have 100 of them. Our position's 100. Congrats. That's really simplistic, right? The minute you try to trading some spreads, your positions are off from a reporting perspective. This is probably the one that gets a lot of our firms the most. So definitely you don't want to default to risk position. The other part of that aggregation I started thinking about, I mentioned options. Here's another thing that people get tripped up on much. Numerically, this won't affect your positions as much as the netting and the stuff we just talked about because these are very large positions. But let's talk about option deltas and what they are. Options have to be aggregated into your futures as well. And so option deltas, you can kind of, I'll take my, again, summary bullet from my simplistic brain and say, it's kind of like the likelihood that that position is going to be exercised in the futures. That's not exactly true. And I put a note on here for the quantitatively focused who will tell me about the 1% move. I know, but that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to say, give a mental model of why do my options have to fit in? And do I just net them in at 100 lots of options? No. If that delta on that option was 0.5, your position's only 50, not 100. So it's the likelihood or it's the futures position that options position is casting as far as your position limits is concerned. So you compute the futures equivalent via the delta. The delta cannot come from your smart quant. It cannot. It's not supposed to. I know your quant's going to say, my delta is the best deltas. I'm the smartest quant on earth. I'm sure he or she is. The rules say you must use the exchange's deltas. And I'll be even more clear. The FCM is not the exchange. Your clearing merchant is not the exchange. The clearinghouse at the exchange that lives under the same legal entity group is not the exchange. They run different calcs. It must be the exchange entity itself. The exchange will give you those deltas. So they are available. You do have to license them, but they are available from the exchanges, and they require a small data subscription. Again, you get it wrong. Small difference, but I've had this with customers where they've been on the phone and there's FCM calls them or somebody from enforcement calls them saying, you're at 101% of the intraday limit on a big product. And they're like, no, we're not. We're at 98%. And the difference has been the delta. So it's a small difference. Everyone's like, it's just a delta. But when you're at the margins, it can be the differentiator. Enough about deltas. Let's go back into, so we talked about aggregation. We talked about positions, when they come into effect. Let's talk a little bit about like exceptions to the process.
Yeah, because you're probably all thinking, wow, this really is complicated, and it is, but you can understand why it's important. So do I have an exemption? There's exemptions for bona fide hedging, which we're going to talk about today. There's also exemptions for spreads, but we don't have time to talk about those today. And there's also an exemption called the conditional limit exemption, but it's only in natural gas. We're also not going to talk about that today. But if you have questions about it, you can just send me an email. It's fine. But the most probably talked about and most, I think interesting exemption is this bona fide hedge exemption. And the reason why I'm saying it's interesting is because we have a different concept in the United States of what hedging is and what bona fide hedging is than like in Europe or the UK. So again, when we get to the next point of this presentation, he's going to talk about, data, and you have to also remember that when your company crosses the globe, you then also have to make sure your data in your book structure is set up where it meets the bona fide hedging exemption. So bona fide hedging exemption has 3 requirements. Okay, so if you're going to claim your position is an exemption to the limit, it doesn't count 3 requirement tests: the temporary substitute test, the economically appropriate test, and the change in value requirement. So temporary substitute test is, it's a bona fide hedge position in physical commodities when in connection with that, it could be used in connection with production, sale, use of something in the physical, cash market commodity, right? So it's like a temporary substitute test. That one I think is the easiest. Economically appropriate test refers to the reduction of price risk, right? So your bona fide hedge position has to reduce your price risk, right? So, you can have economically appropriate test be in a different commodity. So think about, like ethanol being used in fuels, right? So you have like an ethanol future, but your position is in fuels or something like that. You could still use that as a bona fide hedge. And I wrote here some other examples as well. And then your change in value requirement. So it has to be that the value of that bona fide hedging position, the values would tie with essentially your underlying, and I hate using the word underlying because I'm not talking about it as a derivative sense, but that underlying price risk and market risk that you're trying to hedge. So if you go to slide 19, a lot of questions I get here are, well, wait a minute, we're a swap dealer or whatever, and it's not fair that we have to put these positions that we're writing for others into our, position limit levels, when really all we're doing is we're helping somebody else hedge. Those are called pass-through swaps or pass-through swap offset pairs. If you have a pass-through swap counterparty, right, that is executing the swap for bona fide hedging, and you're the swap dealer and you know that it's a bona fide hedge counterparty, you as a swap dealer can treat that position or that swap as a bona fide hedge for yourself, but there are certain conditions that have to be met. And I list them here for you. You have to get a written representation from your counterparty, that says, hey, listen, I think this qualifies as a pass-through, right, as a bona fide hedge. And then you have to make sure that they're entering through the pass-through swap to reduce their price risk. Again, it all goes back to, it has to be tied to that commodity and price risk you have in that commodity. Now, you don't have to do anything crazy or special here. If you're the swap dealer, you're writing the swap, you can rely in good faith on the written representation of your counterparty. Unless you know some information that makes you think this is not true, then you can't. Like, in other words, you can't turn a blind eye. Position limits are very important to the regulators. So if you go to slide 20, the CFTC requires hedging to hedge your net cash position, right? There are limited exceptions to when gross cash positions are considered bona fide hedges, and I put that here, but I put it here just for sake of having complete slides when you take these offline. There are 3 requirements to have gross hedging positions satisfy the bona fide hedging position definition, and I leave those here for you. If you go to slide 21, okay, there are enumerated hedges, non-enumerated hedges, and then how do you even get the hedge exemption, right? So there are certain enumerated bona fide hedges that are just literally, they self-effectuate, right? For the purposes of the CPC limits. Literally, they are what they are, therefore, you don't have to do anything. crazy for the CFTC to get an exemption from the CFTC limits with these self-effectuating positions. However, you still have to ask for an exemption from the exchange. And the exchange has full discretion, they can grant or not based upon your business. Now, to the extent that you have or a market participant has physical hedges that are not enumerated bona fide hedges, then you have to actually apply for a bona fide hedge exemption from both the CFTC limits and the exchange limit. And you can apply to the exchange or the CFTC. However, the following considerations that I list here likely mean that the participant will apply to the DCM. And these are those. The CFTC will review an exchange granted non-enumerated hedge exemption. So any application to the DCM has to address both the CFTC limits and the DCM limit. If a market participant applies to the CFTC, then you have to do a separate application to the DCM. And although there are time limits for the CFTC to review the exchange granted non-enumerated hedge exemptions, there's no time limit for the CFTC to respond. So in other words, you could submit it and 6 months later, the CFTC can get to looking at it and have some questions for you. But it is a process. You do have to go through it. You do need to have good data, because when you put in a position limit hedge exemption request, you do sort of open your kimono into your positions. And that's okay. You just have to make sure that your data is right and that your exemption paperwork is correct. Because if it doesn't make sense to them mathematically, the CFTC and the exchange will both ask questions. And if the exchange asks first and they don't get satisfactory answers, they can always forward that information on to the CFTC.
It's a good question for me, Dina, on that one. Like going back to getting your data together. Like it's not just important to know where you are, but if you want to substantiate an exemption request, it's very helpful for those regards as well, to stay out of Excel.
Yeah, listen, the hedge exemption form is super important, and it's not something that you can fudge, right?
Yeah.
Because it's used often too for when you have, large trader. And I know this is not about large trader requests, but you could also get a large trader request, right? And the exchanges and the CFTC are going to tick and try to see whether what you're putting in your hedge exemption form meets what you're going to put if they ask questions about whether you hit your large trader threshold. So data is super important, and it's not easy, right? So you always ask questions. And sometimes, even as a lawyer, I'm like, that's a good question. What's your book structure look like? How are they trading this, right? And we still have to come up with an answer by digging a little.
So one thing you said, it hadn't occurred to me in any of our prep, but occurs to me to articulate now to folks is like, you can take a one-off approach to some of these things, but if the regulators are correlating answers from different substantive questions, they're asking you in different time periods, the best thing you can do is have systems from which you're reflecting that data as opposed to one-off calculations, right? You want to be able to go back and say, look, it came from there. It's a system. It does everything. And if it's wrong, it's wrong. But we didn't hand calc this, and we're not guessing. With that, I will go to the next slide, which is the next word for CLE credits pillar. While you folks are typing that in, I'm going to ask a question from the chat, Dina, to you that will give people time and also answer this question. The question is, are there any core contracts that should be measured on a gross level and not net for the CFTC limits, either for spot or non-spot?
No, the limits are net. I think what might have thrown people off there, and this is my fault, was with regard to the hedging. There's a hedging exemption for gross hedging positions. Otherwise, they want you to hedge your net position in order for it to be considered a bona fide hedge.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Thank you for that. Let's continue on with some of these exemptions then.
Okay, so I talked a little bit about the procedure for applying for the hedge exemption, but I do give you more detail here because this is an important one. If you are in business and you have price exposure, but you're literally in the business, you don't want to be limiting your positions because then you really aren't hedging your price risk, and you need to, right? That's how we function. So you have to apply in advance, essentially, if you're going to exceed the applicable limit. That makes sense. But, the exchanges are not, they live in commodities. I mean, I work and live and breathe commodities, right? Things change. So you can also apply within 5 days if you're going to exceed a limit due to some sort of sudden or unforeseen hedging need, right? Other than that, the hedge exemption requests have to be done annually. So every year you would apply ahead and then remember that you have this, oh my gosh, there's gonna be a hurricane or whatever. And so you have also this 5-day application you can file. So you have to know when you submit these hedge exemptions and they are granted, they're all subject to review by the CFTC. There's a 10-day review period the CFTC usually has, and it's the CFTC and not the staff that they can either deny or stay or bless the exchange granted exemption, right? So if you have no action from the CFTC, that's usually the blessing, right? And you may exceed as a market participant the CFTC and exchange limits when you get that blessing or that granting of the exception. If the CFTC denies the exemption after the fact, then they do understand it's going to take you some time to unwind your position. You'll have a reasonable time to reduce your position. But you should, like I said earlier, even outside that 10-day period, the CFTC can later on say, hey, listen, this isn't right, and then ask you to come back and reduce your position. So if you can go to slide 24, now we're going to talk about aggregation from the legal and regulatory sense with regard to your position. And this is a tough one for folks. Because a lot of people think, oh, this can't apply to me because we don't even know what they're doing over at XYZ sub company or whatever. But this is a bright line rule, right? Aggregation applies to all positions for market participants if that market participant holds at least 10% equity interest, or where there are multiple accounts with identical trading strategies, they're considered controlled trading strategies, and therefore you must aggregate your position with that 10% equity entity or the controlled position entity. Those are aggregated entities. The aggregation rule provides relief from this aggregation requirement with respect to aggregated entities, where the aggregating entity has no knowledge, no control over the trades of that owned account. There's also some exemptions here for when for where ownership results from a broker-dealer activity, for underwriting, and where sharing information would violate some sort of other law, rule, or regulation, whether it's a U.S. regulation or a foreign jurisdiction. So, like if the CPC says you should be an aggregating entity, but you're like, no, and in this country, I'm not allowed to share that information with my sub, and that would also be an exemption. So this aggregation relief is not available, though, to aggregating entities that control the trading of multiple accounts or entities that have substantially identical trading strategies. So even though, you're like, listen, we can't share the information, and you have an identical trading strategy, you're sort of kind of like, what do I do here? Like, how do I, things are not jiving. And the answer is, holy cow, that is a tough question. How do you even move forward? And in my opinion, we always can go to the CFTC, even if we go to the CFTC on a no-name basis, just to try to figure that out, because I've seen that happen before. In a regular situation, you have to apply. And it's not apply in this sense, like I was talking about before with the hedge exemptions. You must provide notice to the CFTC to get your relief from the aggregation requirements. And a lot of people don't know that. And I have a lot of people that just say, oh, well, we're exempt from aggregation. And, they got some, it always comes back to, I think, the Form 40 request where they get you. And they don't mean to, it's just they're looking for your information. And then I get brought in as a lawyer and 440, and I'm like, well, what about this entity? What about that entity? And they're like, oh, no. We don't have to aggregate. And then I say, well, where's the notice that you filed with CPC? And they're like, oh, weird. But that is definitely part of the rule. And this is something where, the practical implications of this could be a challenge if you're across jurisdictions, if you have multiple book structures. And so make sure to back over to Vivek, because he's going to talk to you about some things that he's seen with regards to aggregation of entities positions. So Vivek, back to you.
So I'm just going to recap just to make sure I move forward and play back to Dina the things I'm obligated to do as the data guy who's going to operationalize the stuff. So I know I have to get my data together. I know I have to make sure that the total amount within a certain period of time is below a certain limit. I got to figure out when that time is because the exchange doesn't tell me ahead of time when the spot starts. I need to aggregate all my data together and use some logic according to them. But it sounds like from the last few slides, there's some exceptions. There's some times where Dina may come to us or the compliance team may come to us and say, hey, the limit I know is 5,000. We can go up to 6,000 because there's, for some legal reasons, some exemptions that we get as an entity. I don't know all the details there, but I trust my compliance team. And there may be times where we have to aggregate maybe the hedge fund that we started that no one else is allowed to see. And then what I realized, Dina, is like, I'm going to do all those things for you, and you're going to become the data czar because no one in the whole institution can see any of this stuff. And this happens to a lot of us. Well, the quiet hedge fund has to be aggregated into the positions that everybody else can see, but no one else can see it now except for compliance. From a reporting perspective, we need to be able to tell you as an entity-wide, you're at a certain level. However, not tell you where the genesis of that level necessarily is. But compliance needs to know where that sits so they can foster the conversation between who's going to reduce their positions in this weird world where they know everybody's, but the trader desk don't necessarily know. So it's a very sticky situation, but it's about data. So if you can get your data together, you can manage that, pretty easy. Let's talk a little bit about exemptions, how we handle those. Like when I think about those as a practitioner on the data side, I'm thinking, okay, well, I know a speed limit that is given to us, or the position limit, let's call it, right? Mentally, I'm just calling it a speed limit to give you guys a mental model. But hey, don't go faster than X, is what they're saying. Sometimes we can actually go faster than X, it looks like, for some reasonable purposes. So whatever model I bring and say don't exceed X, I know I have to have the ability to just have an exemption for that, for whatever compliance says. And I need to have them be time limited because I don't want there to be a hedge exemption on that just stays on saying we can go to 6,000 when it's expired. And actually, we can't go to 6,000 anymore. And by desk thinks we can go further than we can. We just popped a limit. The exemption was expired. So I have to have them be time limited in an automated way. One thing that's interesting is with the introduction of CCC limits for like products like crude, like CL, you see tiered limits at the end. So the last 3 days, the third day before for expiry might be 6,000 as a limit, then 5,000, then 4,000. So you have the decrementing limits. So I assume, Dina, my exemptions could also be like tiered like that. And I have to like think about a way to not just put a blanket number that we can hit, but that number may be shaped based on our approvals. And so I have to cater for that in some capacity, Well, and if I don't, I'm at a point where, again, compliance is going to be left scrambling as those dates hit. And it's going to be a lot of manual efforts and going back and forth. And in a small shop, that might be okay because you might all be sitting close together. But as things become distributed geographically and you want to have asynchronous sort of trading operations that are independently operating, it's tough because you're actually tethered from disseminating this really critical information to stay compliant. So exemptions are some of the stuff that can trip people up. Typically, we see a lot of the firms rolling their same 1 year hedge exemptions year after year. But in the context of things that are changing, this is one thing that people assume is in place and just get used to it being there. And when it expires and it's no longer there, it's somewhat of a surprise. So I think whatever you do here, the time limited thing, even if you put a calendar meeting request or mind yourself, is better than nothing, but automated software is, ideal.
So I did answer a question in the chat or in the Q&A about did it have the CFTC ever gone back and denied a hedge exemption that was filled by the exchange? And the answer is yes. What often happens when the market participant stops essentially complying with the conditions of that hedge exemption application, which you really raise a good point, Vivek, which is people usually just take the year before and they just send it and then they don't, something's changed in their business or, they have new people that are heading up the trading or whatever, and then they don't realize the conditions that were in there. So yes, it does happen. But I don't mean to make it sound like, and I hope I'm not, that this is impossible because everything here is possible. It's just what we do for a living in the commodity markets is super important to the world. It is our food supply, it is our energy supply, and it is very important because, as we saw in 2008, we can bring down the financial system if we're not careful with how we're speculating around the prices of these things that we actually need, right? Which is our food and our energy. So it's all possible. Just for what we do, just a little more complicated than most, right? Not complicated in the way where it's impossible, just complicated in the way where you got to think about it. Um, and I hope that that comes across because I don't mean to make it sound like it's not doable. I've been doing this
You
forever.
you you brought
Okay,
up a really good point, Dina, which is it is complicated and that is but it is doable. And what's interesting is all the firms that are probably, listening, people working at firms listening are doing many more complicated things like actually measuring value at risk and P&L. So you have systems that are doing some really complicated things. The challenge is that we don't have a lot of systems institutionally that are supporting compliance for stuff like this in an automated way. And so we see a lot of like manual human efforts behind these things. I mean, most of the challenges that I raised here are because we said, we don't want to build that. Let's just quickly kind of get after something. And the only thing I just caution everybody is like it's fine to do upfront. After a few of those decisions, you become under a mound of, it's hard to escape under that, let's call it operational debt of delivering those numbers to your desk. But it is doable. There are a lot of firms who automate this internally or by vendor software or otherwise.
so if you don't mind, could you put back on the QR code for the lawyers in case they need to scan it
Absolutely.
again? So
Absolutely.
here's the QR code for the lawyers in case you need to scan it again. I'm not sure if you have my name or my contact information, but you can get it from Vivek or the internet. I'm on the internet if you have any questions. But it's been my pleasure. I'm so happy to spend the morning with you. Thank you for having me.
Likewise, thank you, Dina, for your expertise. I'll open the floor if there are questions. Keep typing them in. I am looking at the Q&A and the chats. Um, Let me try and think if there's any other final words of wisdom. The one thing I can say also, just an aside I thought of is I measured and managed compliance or position limits kind of reporting when I was at Lehman Brothers, and the traders would always want spreadsheets and grids and numbers. And it's a cool story. I actually fought them physically, be like, we're going to give you visual charts so you can stand back 6 feet from a screen and know where your positions are and what you should be paying attention to. Uh, I would say with this stuff of information, numerical information, the more visual you can get, the easier you make it for your desk to stay in compliance. It's lower cognitive burden. It's my nerd tip for the day.
You keep calling yourself a nerd. I think you're making me a nerd in that bucket, which is okay. I
I
see.
love that bucket. It's like I got actually tapped with that when I went through the Federal Register and read all the rules because I was interested in this stuff. It's cool. It's part of makes markets go. And like you said, it's an important aspect of how we measure the food supply and all the stuff that's important in the physical world. So I don't see any more questions coming through. So perhaps with that, we will close and give everybody 4 minutes back on their wonderful Friday.
Thank you guys. I see you guys
Thank
are
you,
speaking to
everyone.
the chat, so thank you.
Thank you again, Dina. Have a wonderful day and weekend, everybody. Cheers.
Bye.